Hello again. I'd like to continue now with the reading of Trout Fishing in Chilean Rivers. This is from chapter 4, starting at chapter 4. History and Development of Trout in Chile. I am indebted to the Department of Fisheries of the Chilean government for the statistical information they have given me with regard to the introduction of trout in Chile. The credit for the introduction of trout into Chile belongs without any doubt to the late Federico Albert, a German citizen who persuaded the Chilean government of the advisability of introducing salmon and trout to the eminently suitable rivers in the country. And I found a photograph of him, Federico Albert, 1867 to 1928. And there he is. Whoops. There you go. Right. And he was nominated the first chief of the Department of Fisheries, which was set up in the year 1905. He established the hatchery at Rio Blanco in that year and then proceeded to Germany to superintend the acquisition of salmon and trout ova, that's eggs, for Chilean rivers. At the same time, he engaged two technical men, one of whom, Don Pedro Golusta, was still with the department until a few years ago, and all three set sail for Chile with 150 salmon and trout fingerlings. Fingerling is a small young fish, especially one less than 1 year old and about the size of a human finger, which did not survive the sea trip, and 400,000 ova distributed as follows. Atlantic salmon, Rhine, Salmo salar, 160,000, 40%. Brown trout, Salmo fario, 160,000, 40%. Rainbow trout, Salmo irideus, 40,000, 10%, and sea trout, Salmo trutta, 40,000, 10%. I have seen it stated in newspaper articles in this country that the rainbow trout were originally imported to Chile from the Shasta Valley in California, their native waters. I am assured, however, by the Department of Fisheries that no rainbow trout ova have ever come to Chile from California, but that the original supply for the hatchery at Rio Blanco was brought from Germany. The sea trip from Hamburg to Valparaiso via Cape Horn in those days was a long and arduous one, and as it was feared that the majority of the eggs would hatch out before the ship arrived at its destination, two of the party had to disembark at Buenos Aires and proceed overland to Rio Blanco with part of the valuable eggs. I mention this matter as an indication that the introduction of ova at that time was fraught with difficulties. Further shipments of ova from Germany with approximately the same distribution as in the first instance were made as follows. 1906, 400,000 ova, 1907, 400,000 ova, 1908, 600,000 ova, 1909, 400,000 ova, and 1912, 600,000 ova. In the year 1907, the importation of 40,000 ova of brook trout, Salvelinus fontinalis, was made from the Argentine Republic. The surviving ova from those shipments were hatched out at Rio Blanco, and the resultant fry were liberated annually from 1905 to 1914 in the main rivers, ranging from the Aconcagua in the central zone to the Puelo in the southern vicinity of Puerto Montt. According to the official statistics, over 2,300,000 fry were distributed over 14 of the main rivers in those years. The result was that the acclimatization of the trout prospered beyond all expectations, and indeed trout fishing in Chile is ranked today in the first flight of such fishing in the whole world. Alas and alackaday, the story of the Salmo salar is not such good reading as, apart from a few isolated specimens which were said to have been taken in the river Cotin, I suppose, there was no sign of their acclimatization by the year 1914. As the subject of the failure to acclimatize salmon in Chile is rather an interesting one, I propose to deal with it in a separate chapter, and for the moment will limit my observations to trout. By the year 1914, therefore, trout had been successfully introduced in the main rivers. The hatchery at Rio Blanco was a going concern. Ova were available in considerable quantities annually from spawning fish, and there was no need to go to the trouble and expense of further importations of trout ova. as further stocking and restocking requirements could be bred artificially. However, in order to extend the radius of action of the department, a second hatchery was established in that year in Lautaro, and indeed this hatchery was necessary for the annual restocking of the southern rivers. The River Blanco, close to the Rio Blanco hatchery, and a portion of the River Cotin at Lautaro have been reserved by the Chilean government for the exclusive use of the hatcheries, and from those rivers, officials of the hatcheries obtain the milt, which is the semen of male fish, and ova from the spawning trout in the close season for incubation purposes. Milt, M-I-L-T. The capacity of the hatcheries today is 800,000 ova in Rio Blanco and 2,500,000 in Lautaro. It is interesting to know that the Chilean hatcheries have supplied trout fry to the Argentine Republic, Bolivia, Colombia, and Peru. Several years ago, the Argentine Republic sent in return a consignment of the ova of landlocked salmon, Salmo cebago, and promised also freshwater herring, pejere, which thrive exceedingly well in Argentine rivers. The landlocked salmon fry were liberated in River Tolten, but no news has been heard of them. Subsequent to the year 1914, there were no further importations of trout ova, with the exception of a special lot of lake trout, Christivoma namaekush ova, included with the salmon ova introduced in the year 1930 from the United States of America. The resultant fry from the lake trout ova were deposited in the Laguna del Inca, the lake at Portillo, a station on the international railway line to the Argentine Republic, and also in Lake Villarrica. But so far, a few specimens have been caught only in the Laguna del Inca. In the 1930 shipment, there were also included whitefish, Coregonus clupeiforme ova, which were also utilized for stocking Lake Villarrica. As fishing in Chile is almost entirely confined to the rivers, and the lakes are only fished very superficially, it is not surprising that no specimens of lake trout or whitefish have yet been reported from Lake Villarrica. Reports of strange unidentified fish caught in the Trancura Bar, however, give me the impression that they might have been lake trout or whitefish. The descriptions of the fish given by the hotel officials tally with those species, and it is unfortunate that the specimens found their way to the frying pan without being officially identified. They have been reported as having the appearance of hybrid fish, that is to say, a cross between brown and rainbow trout. For my part, I have never seen a fish with the appearance of a hybrid, but I have heard of curious cases. For instance, a friend tells me that in February last, he caught a fish at Lifen, which he thinks was a cross between a rainbow trout and a trucha común. Unfortunately, he was unable to preserve the specimen for expert examination. Steelhead trout, Salmo gaedneri, are to be found in certain rivers in the far south, but not north of the River Tolten, as far as I am aware. The steelhead trout, as is well known, is closely related to the rainbow trout, and indeed most authorities maintain that they are one and the same species, the only differences being in coloring and habits. According to this theory, the steelhead is simply a rainbow with seagoing tendencies, which are responsible for the differences in coloring. The steelhead having a steel blue back and silvery sides, as opposed to the blue-gray or green back and bright rainbow coloring on the sides of the rainbow. Other authorities claim that, while they agree that originally they were one species, in the course of time, the steelhead, as a result of its life in the sea, has developed as a distinct species. And the local authorities state that a small quantity of steelhead ova was introduced into Chile specifically as such, although classified under the one general heading of irideus. Steelheads are taken not only in the rivers near the sea, such as the Tolten, but frequently also in the rivers in the vicinity of the Cordillera, such as the Trancura. And as regards the latter, many local anglers believe that such specimens live in the large inland lakes instead of the sea and only go up the rivers to spawn. In other words, the lakes take the place of the sea and there is no need for the fish to go to the sea to attain the characteristics of the steelhead, provided that the inland lakes contain the necessary food. The steelhead is a very game fish, and its wonderful fighting qualities are no doubt due to its life in salt water or the equivalent. I have seen a published statement that Dolly Vardens, that's Salvelinus malma, it's a char, not a trout, named after a character in Barnaby Rudge by Charles Dickens. Dolly Vardens have been caught in the south, but this is presumably a mistake, as there is no evidence of the ova having been introduced into the country. It is possible, however, that the specimens reported were lake trout, as the two fish are, of course, very alike. The stocking of brook trout has been very limited, and since the year 1914, the fry have only been liberated in the rivers Aconcagua, Arayán, and Cotin, and in the Laguna del Inca. I believe that they are still to be found in the upper reaches of the Arayán, but there is not recent or reliable corroboration of this information. In the Laguna del Inca, they thrived for a time, but it is now reported that the other species in the lake trout, brown trout, etc., are getting the better of them, and they are expected to disappear eventually. As the lake is notably short of food, it is unlikely that the brook trout will survive the fight for existence. It would be a pity to see the brook trout entirely eliminated from Chilean waters. It is a sporting fish, and as a table delicacy has no equal in the trout family. It is reported that sea trout are to be found in large quantities in the tidal waters of the river Chamisa near Puerto Montt. I have also heard from a reliable source of sea trout being taken in the Laraquete, in the vicinity of Coronel near Concepcion. This is the only actual information to hand of their existence in Chilean waters today, although it is quite feasible that they are to be found in many coastal rivers in the south, and are caught regularly and identified by sea fishermen in the estuaries of the main rivers. An angler friend informs me that in the Aysén district, the rivers, while being in every way suitable for salmon and trout, are rather short and precipitous and contain little in the shape of ground feeding, at least in relation to the countless numbers of trout which inhabit these waters. The result is that many trout go out into the estuary where the water is salt and eventually return to the rivers to spawn, having lived the life of a salmon in the interval. The theory is entertained by some local fishermen that in the course of time, a new species of fish will be developed in the shape of a trout, but with all the characteristics of a salmon. But surely it will merely be a large-sized steelhead or sea trout. It is reported that each year in the month of May, many very large fish can be observed on their way up those Aysén rivers, but this information does not emanate from a reliable source. Nevertheless, it seems that the matter might bear investigation by the Department of Fisheries. Since the year 1914, the stocking and restocking of rivers has been carried out annually from the two hatcheries, with the satisfactory result that today there are few rivers or streams, if indeed any, from the river Aconcagua in the north to Cape Horn, where trout cannot be found. Amateur fishermen have willingly assisted in the stocking of the rivers, and the Director of Fisheries has been glad of their cooperation. Treating the steelhead and the rainbow as one species, that is to say, as rainbow trout, the statement can safely be made that there are only two varieties of trout to be found in Chilean rivers today, namely the rainbow and the brown. Until a few years ago, there were rivers where only rainbow trout were to be found, but today, I doubt if there are anywhere brown trout have not penetrated. From the statistics I have already given you, you will observe that brown and rainbow trout were introduced into Chile in the ratio of 4:1, respectively, and statistics also show that the stocking of the rivers was carried out on a similar basis. The rainbow, as is well known, migrates more readily than the brown trout, and this fact is exemplified clearly in Chile, where the rainbow in the early days found its way quickly up rivers, across lakes, and into rivers higher up in the vicinity of the Cordillera, where only in recent years have the brown trout commenced to appear. There is nothing unusual in this state of affairs, which is in keeping with the natural characteristics of the two species. The brown trout is less active and prefers the bigger and stiller waters in the lower reaches of the rivers, to the rapids and strong currents in the upper reaches where the rainbow is in his element. And in the more rapid rivers where the brown trout has penetrated, you will generally find him in the deeper pools and quieter waters away from the current where the rainbow lurks. Of the two varieties, there is no doubt that the rainbow trout is by far the more desirable from the fisherman's point of view, and unless he is out of condition or hooked in such a way that fight is impossible, he can be relied upon to put up a very good show. The brown trout, on the other hand, is more sluggish in character, and the larger specimens, when hooked, are more inclined to go down to the bottom and sulk than to fight for their freedom. As a matter of preference, give me a 4-pound rainbow before an 8-pound brown trout. It is noteworthy, however, that towards the close of the season, the brown trout on the way up river to spawn puts up a splendid fight and is an entirely different problem to the fish hooked in the early part of the season. The brown and the rainbow trout, in keeping with their natural habits, take up their respective positions in the bigger rivers in the south, and there appears to be plenty of room and plenty of food for both. In certain streams in the central zone, however, there are far too many fish, and there is too little food, with the inevitable result that the predatory instincts of the fish predominate and the fish degenerate quickly. In such streams, systematic netting under the direction of the Department of Fisheries would be a good thing, but this does not get over the lack of food. In the course of time, in such streams where the conditions of too many fish and too little food are accentuated, the fish change in appearance even, and it gives one the creeps to catch a trout with a big head and long, slender body with no inclination to fight. I should emphasize that this only applies to some of the rivers and streams in the central zone, and not at all to the rivers in the intermediate and southern zones, where there is no evidence whatever of degeneration. As you go south, the first definite signs of improvement in the condition of the fish are to be found in the river Claro at Molina and the river Achibueno south of Linares, where the flesh of the fish is pink, and there is every evidence of plenty of ground feeding, as in the south. The question of the relative tendency to degeneration of rainbow and brown trout has been widely discussed in Chile, and without being dogmatic about it, I think the general consensus of opinion is that in a stream where the space and food are limited, and there is a preponderance of brown trout over rainbow, the fish degenerate more readily. It is also considered that where the brown and rainbow trout are evenly matched and the question of living space is involved, the brown trout will predominate in the course of time, with the inevitable result. This opinion is held so strongly by some of the older fishermen in this country that there is an unwritten law among them, it must be unwritten as it contravenes the fishing regulations, that no brown trout, however small, is ever put back, and I am inclined to believe it is a good thing. As interesting evidence of the cannibalistic habits of trout, the picture on page blank, unfortunately, there are no pictures. I wonder what happened to them. The picture on page blank shows a 5-pound brown trout with a small trout half consumed. It gives some idea of the voracity of the fish when they are feeding. This trout, before having properly devoured the small fish, could not resist the fly offered to him and was afraid he might miss it if he waited. It is not uncommon, on opening up a large trout, to discover a small fish inside, and cases have been reported where 2 or 3 small ones have been found tucked away. I remarked in the previous chapter that trout thrive in the south of Chile and grow to abnormally big sizes. Experience shows that the larger fish caught are more often than not brown trout, and on the average, the brown trout appears to grow to a bigger size than the rainbow. There are no official records in Chile of big fish taken, and information in this connection cannot be relied upon, as big fish are frequently not even reported. I had originally planned to prepare a list of big trout taken for publication in this book, but a census of my fishing friends showed me very quickly that such a list was impracticable, as the catching of trout between 10 and 15 pounds is almost an everyday occurrence. There are, however, relatively few recorded cases of catches of 15 pounds and over, and with these I propose to deal in detail as far as I can. There are bound to be many cases of which I have never heard. In the Department of Fisheries, there is on show a 24-pound brown trout, but this specimen was caught in a net in the river Cotin by the hatchery officials at Lautaro. As far as I know, the record brown trout taken on rod and line in Chile stands to the credit of H.D. Humpstone, who caught a 20-pounder in the River San Pedro in March 1937. The details of his fish were weight 20 pounds, length 33.5 inches, girth 23.5 inches. While this catch was being celebrated in the usual fashion at the local fishing hotel, A.W.F. Duncan turned up with a fine 12-pound rainbow of which he was rightly proud, and was astonished at the reaction of the group of celebrating fishermen who described it as a sardine. Sorry. He must have felt as if he shouldn't have mentioned it. During the 1939 season, M. Klein caught a brown trout weighing 19 pounds 2 ounces in the river Trancura, and in 1938, the late John P. Chadwick caught an 18-pound brown trout on a fly in the Enco Bar. In the month of January 1940, the late John P. Chadwick caught a 15-pound rainbow trout in the river Enco, and at that time it was the biggest rainbow, I believe, to be taken on rod and line in this country. Then 1 month later, Senor Nicolas Correa, a Chilean young man on his first fishing expedition, broke all records by catching by far the biggest rainbow ever heard of in Chile in the bar of the river Trancura at Pucón. The particulars of this magnificent specimen, of which a photograph appears on page blank, were as follows. Weight 20 pounds, 14.5 ounces, length 34.5 inches, width 10 inches, girth 22 inches. Towards the end of the 1939-40 season, 2 more large rainbow were taken in the bar at Pucón, one of 18 pounds by J. McDowell, also on his first fishing expedition, and the other stated to have been between 19 and 20 pounds by the boatman Zapata. In the early part of that season also, an 18-pound rainbow was caught by F. Compton. Senor Arturo Medina of Concepcion is reported to have caught an 18-pound rainbow in the Laja in the year 1941. As far as I am aware, the biggest rainbow ever caught on rod and line in Chile was a 22-pounder, and the fisherman was Captain F. Long, a Panagra pilot. This magnificent fish was taken on an oreno at dusk in the pool just above Prado Verde on the river Tolten. It is reported that when the fish was finally landed, after a great struggle, Captain Long demonstrated his enthusiasm in no uncertain fashion by first kissing his wife, then the fish, and finally the astonished boatman, after which the celebration followed the usual lines. There are unconfirmed reports of the catching of a 23-pound rainbow in Lake Maule, or is that Maule, and 24-pound rainbow in the River Bueno. And indeed, there is no reason to doubt the authenticity of the reports in a country where big fish abound. Scales of some of the bigger fish taken in Chile have been sent abroad for examination and report. They generally show the fish to be from 5 to 6 years old. For the first 2 or 3 years, the growth is comparatively slow and therefore thereafter very rapid. As a rule, they show at least 2 spawning marks. It is generally accepted among our local fishermen that in Chile there are 2 main runs of fish, one in the early part of the season in December and the other usually in March and April. It is certainly noticeable that the bigger fish are caught for the most part early on or late in the season and rarely in January or February. There has always been a certain amount of discussion among fishermen in Chile as to the reason for the abnormal size to which the trout grow in the south. Some hold the opinion that a great number of the fish live the greater part of their life in the sea and only return to the rivers to spawn, but with the possible exception of the steelhead in the southerly rivers, I cannot see any grounds for this contention. The explanation would appear to be simply that the rivers and lakes in the south of Chile are particularly rich in ground food, of which the freshwater crab, apancora, is one of the tastiest delicacies. Another factor contributing to the growth of the trout is the freshwater herring, pejerrey, which abounds in the rivers and lakes in the south and is a favorite food of the trout. This fish, however, is not now so prolific as previously, and this may account in part for the decreased size of the trout in certain rivers. It is understood that the Department of Fisheries is contemplating the importation shortly of trout ova on a considerable scale with the object of reinvigorating the fish in Chilean waters. The proposal commends itself as a good one, as it is important that the high standard of Chilean trout fishing should be maintained. I am sure that an ichthyologist would find a great deal to interest him in the southern waters of Chile. It must be frankly admitted that there is no one in Chile, as far as one knows, who devotes himself to a study of the life of the Salmonidae family, or who has the necessary knowledge, with the result that most of our theories are derived from intelligent observation and, to a large extent, conjecture. There is no such thing as marking or tagging fish in this country. When you read later on of what has happened in many rivers, and particularly Lake Puyehue, you will agree with me that fishing conditions in this country require to be studied by experts. The need is urgent if the excellence of the fishing is to be maintained. There are, of course, other fish in Chilean rivers, such as carp, pejere, already mentioned, and the trucha común, the Chilean species of perch and a most disappointing fish other than for its edible qualities. One hears very little nowadays of the peladilla, which might be described as the native species of trout, and it is said that it is gradually becoming extinct and can only be found now in certain isolated rivers, such as the Carampangue near Coronel. A game surface feeder with graceful lines, it unfortunately never seems to grow to any size. I do not propose in this book, however, to consider from the sporting standpoint any freshwater fish other than trout, as obviously in a country where trout abound in such quality and quantity, the angler will not be interested in coarse fishing. And then there's a further note. Fortunately, in January and February of this year, 1952, a visit has been made by a fisherman of world renown, Roderick Haig Brown. This is Roderick Langmuir Haig Brown, 1908 to 1976, Canadian writer, angler, and conservationist born in Lancing, England. His book, Fisherman's Winter, published 1954, describes his angling exploration of Chile. So a visit was made by Roderick Haig Brown, and he has fished most of the prominent rivers in the south of Chile. His knowledge of the species of salmon and trout and their characteristics is extensive, and his findings are awaited by fishermen in Chile with the keenest interest. He combines with his recognition as a biological expert a well-deserved reputation as one of the world's most skilled fly fishermen, and his experience in the south will be well worth reading. So that was the book, Fisherman's Winter, published in 1954. Okay, I continue with chapter 5. Why are there no salmon in Chile? The word salmon in English and Spanish has a totally different meaning in this country. In Spanish, it means simply any member of the Salmo family, and not merely the Salmo salar, Atlantic salmon, as in English. All the different species of trout are salmones, and the word trucha refers to a native fish quite different from any trout. No one can cavil at my definition in the preceding paragraph of the colloquial usage of the words salmon and trucha, or salmon and trucha in Chile, but it is interesting to note that in a decree published in the year 1934 containing fishing regulations, a determined effort has been made by the authorities to use the words correctly, examples of which are salmon rey, king salmon, and trucha arcoiris, rainbow trout. A consequence of this confusion is that there are constant rumors of salmon being caught in the south, and on investigation, the alleged salmon turns out to be large-sized brown, steelhead, or sea trout. Many people in this country who should know better make the literal translation from Spanish to English, and it is very irritating to hear constant references to salmon, which one knows can only refer to trout. The abnormal size to which trout grow in this country, of course, adds to the confusion. It is stated that a few isolated specimens of salmon were taken in the river Cotin in the early days, but there is no real confirmation of the report, and for practical purposes, I think it can be ignored. I think it is safe to say that the acclimatization of salmon, Salmo salar, in Chile has been a complete failure up to the present time. And a footnote was added in 1952 at this point. Recent reports of salmon having been caught in the river Petrohue appear to have some foundation, although unfortunately scales of the fish were not kept for identification purposes. The fish are believed to be landlocked salmon, Salmos sebago, which have come down from the southern Argentine lakes through the river Puelo into the Reloncaví estuary, from where they have found their way up to the river Petrohue. During the past season, several specimens have been taken, including one of 15 pounds by Charles G. Buxi, trolling in Lake Todos Los Santos at the outlet of the river Petrohue. This is good news. I think Charles Bush was a friend, and that's why he's given the nickname of Buxi is mentioned. In the previous chapter, I mentioned importations of the ova of Atlantic Rhine salmon to Chile from the years 1905 to 1912, which were hatched out in the Rio Bianco hatchery. The fry were liberated annually in rivers from the Aconcagua in the north to the Puelo in the south, but there was apparently no result apart from the few isolated specimens reported to have appeared in the river Cotin. At this stage, it was apparently decided that it would be more feasible to acclimatize Pacific salmon in Chile, and the attention of the authorities was turned to that possibility. In the year 1924, the Bureau of Fisheries of the United States sent down to Chile 80,000 ova of sockeye salmon. The shipment was made in a cargo boat, which took a long time to reach Chile, and the result was far from good, as only 10,000 fry hatched out, all of which were planted in the river Cotin. Once again, the efforts of the Department of Fisheries were doomed to failure, which is not surprising in this case, as one of the peculiarities of the sockeye salmon is its refusal to enter any river that has no lake adjoining it. And the Cotin was obviously the wrong river to choose. This species largely supplies the canning industry in the west of Canada, Alaska, and the United States, but from the sporting standpoint is not so highly rated as the Atlantic, quinat, or coho salmon. In the eyes of the angler, it is the least desirable of the salmon family. The latest determined attempt to introduce salmon to Chile was made in the year 1930, when Don Pedro Golusta went to British Columbia and returned with 1 million ova, of which 400,000 were ova of lake trout and whitefish. The salmon ova distribution was the following. Quinat, Chinook tai, spring or king salmon, Oncorhynchus chawitscha, 200,000. I've got found the quinat. There we are, there's the quinat. Adult male. Okay, and then sockeye, blueback or red salmon, Oncorhynchus nerca, 200,000. And coho or silver salmon, Oncorhynchus kisuch, 200,000. And here are the sockeye and coho salmon in my footnote. Originally, those were color drawings, but they became black and white in the printing process. As every fisherman knows, the foregoing are the recognized types of Pacific salmon, and great hopes were entertained of their successful acclimatization in Chile. As in the case of previous importations, the eggs were hatched out in the Rio Blanco hatchery, where the water is colder than in Lautaro, and the resultant fry, about 50%, were liberated in the rivers in the south from the Cotin to the Aysén. By this time, it was realized that there was little chance of success in the rivers in the central zones, and the colder waters of the southern rivers were considered more likely to prove successful. But there is still nothing to report. What has happened to the salmon? That is the burning question, and the Director of Fisheries and many fishermen in Chile would like to know the answer. Many theories have been advanced by local fishermen as to why salmon have not become acclimatized in Chile, and most of them are rather far-fetched. For instance, it is said that the salmon fry have been devoured by predatory trout already in the rivers, but this does not explain the failure of the first few years when the salmon and trout fry were liberated together. Another point to remember also is that the real fight for existence does not lie in the river, but in the sea. I think the best way to attack the problem is to learn from experience in New Zealand, where the conditions are very similar to those in Chile and where, after many unsuccessful attempts, quinat salmon first and Atlantic salmon later were finally acclimatized. The story of the acclimatization of quinat salmon in New Zealand is briefly that from the year 1864 to the end of the 19th century, every attempt to introduce salmon into New Zealand rivers ended in failure. The credit for the success finally attained belongs to the late Mr. L.F. Asen, Chief Inspector of Fisheries, who had made a special study of the subject in other countries and made it his ambition and life's work to achieve success in his own country. Research drove him to the conclusion that it was useless sending out small scattered forces of salmon fry to conquer rivers and sea full of savage and voracious enemies, that it was not sufficient that a river had all the necessary characteristics, but the sea must also be right, and that stocking had to be intensive and systematic and concentrated in one river until success was attained. This part is underlined, concentrated in one river. His next step was to choose his river, and after a study of the temperatures of rivers and sea, he settled on the river Waitaki in the South Island and had a hatchway built in the vicinity thereof in the year 1900. In the following year, a shipment of 500,000 quinat ova arrived, and 4 further similar shipments were made in the following years. Each year, all the available fry were liberated in the river Waitaki until finally, in the year 1906, a female quinat salmon of 8 pounds was caught in a trap in a tributary of the Waitaki, and from that time, progress was fast. The quinat salmon increased by leaps and bounds and every year and spreading to other rivers also. Subsequently, efforts were made to introduce sockeye salmon, which were abandoned as a failure, and still later, following on the policy of concentrating on one river, Atlantic salmon, Salmo salar, were acclimatized, but I believe that the authorities are dissatisfied with the results achieved in this case, as the fish run small and show signs of developing into a landlocked variety. In the course of time, however, it is anticipated that the Atlantic variety will be thoroughly and satisfactorily established in New Zealand rivers, as in the case of the quinat. I wonder if that's happened. I don't know. Perhaps somebody can tell me in the comments. If the situation in Chile is examined in the light of experience in New Zealand, the conclusion is reached that the failure of the early importations of the ova of Atlantic Rhine salmon between the years 1905 and 1914 might be attributed to any one or all of several reasons as follows. 1, the rivers in which the fry were liberated were wrong. From the years 1905 to 1910, the rivers selected were from the Aconcagua in the north to the Bueno in the south, and in the years 1910, 1911, and 1913, the rivers Molin, Pescado, Coihuin, Petrohue, and Puelo were stocked. I cannot believe that the tepid main rivers north of the Cotin could possibly be suitable, and evidently this was the conclusion of the authorities, as after the first few years, attention was given to the more southerly rivers. 2, the sea off the Chilean coast is wrong. The temperature of the sea is given as ranging between 53 degrees Fahrenheit in the south and 57 degrees in the north. The Humboldt current, which runs in a northerly direction up the Chilean coast, is a cold current, and it is difficult to imagine that there could be anything wrong with the sea from the point of view of the acclimatization of salmon. 3, the stocking was spread over too many rivers. Examination of the records shows that the quantities of fry liberated in the early years were insignificant in each river, when it is remembered that only a small percentage, possibly not more than 2%, of the fish survived to return to spawn in their native rivers. The most probable explanation is the last, and it would apply also to the later importation in the year 1930. If further attempts to acclimatize salmon are to be made in Chile, as they surely will be made, may I respectfully suggest to the authorities that they concentrate on 2 suitable and carefully chosen rivers in the far south, and that they make the attempt to acclimatize the Atlantic and Pacific varieties separately, that is to say, Atlantic salmon in one river and Pacific in the other, and that the stocking be carried out intensively and systematically year after year until they take. Experience shows that the only way to achieve success in the acclimatization of salmon is to remember Bruce, that's Robert the Bruce, and the spider. And if at first you don't succeed, try again. I hear that an attempt has been made to introduce landlocked salmon from the Traful district in the Argentine Republic to the river Huahun, east of Pangui Pulli. This may prove a step in the right direction from the sporting point of view, but I feel that more is required. It is my belief that Chile is the natural salmon country of South America, and that the introduction of salmon should be considered from the industrial as well as the sporting angle. As a further suggestion to the authorities, it would seem practical to engage a young man in the early 30s who has been brought up in a salmon fishery in the Northern Hemisphere and make it worth his while to settle in Chile for the purpose of introducing the real Salmon salar, Atlantic salmon. Quite apart from the question of salmon, I believe that his usefulness would be felt in the better preservation of the trout fishing and the general improvement of fishing conditions for the visitor. Of course, the authorities would have to be prepared to wait for results and give him proper backing, financial and otherwise, without which his work would be of no avail. The opportunity for the right man would be a big one, and I cannot imagine there would be great difficulty in finding a young enthusiast ready to take the plunge on such a pioneering undertaking. He would certainly carry with him in his work the good wishes of all fishermen in the country. And that is the end of chapter 5. So I shall stop here and continue later on. Thank you very much for listening.